Welcome to Worldbuilding and Storytelling. My name is Maggie Kuyatt, and I teach creative writing and write about video games for magazines like Game Crate. I also write novels. My most recent one is Good Different, about an autistic girl who at a con like this learns to self-advocate. And I've got one forthcoming about a girl who finds a ghost in her grandmother's walls, and through playing pranks with the ghost on her grandmother learns how to deal with messy family members.
And I'm Mary Beth Dahl, but for my fiction I go by MB Dahl. I have a couple novels out, and I'm currently working on the sequel to my dystopian adventure series, which is about a girl, Ren, who is for the good of all. It was published in 2021 with Public Publishing, and it's about a girl who lives in a world where nothing is forbidden, everything goes, as long as it's for the good of all. But she, Ren, has some secrets that they found out about him aren't for the good of all. So follows her. I like to tell stories about how the average are really extraordinary, how we work through our weaknesses, and be warriors in life. But I also do freelance writing and do editing.
Awesome. Great. So for us to get started, I'd love for us to talk a little bit about what you think makes an engaging and believable world.
I think it's really important for the world to connect, even though I know we deal with a lot of really strange worlds, different things that happen there, but I think it's important for them to connect on an emotional level with people, and I think that we do that in different ways. I mean, I think that you have, like at the Shire was, I think that you can connect with how it's a place of home, that causes a feeling, and when we can create a world, something in our world that helps to connect to a feeling, it helps our readers kind of join it and be part of it. So, and I think it also is really important for it all to kind of make sense in the realm that it builds on. You build on different parts of it. So I think it's good that you start out with, you can start simple or complex, but either way, it all needs to make sense. You need to ask yourself questions. How's this work? What's going to happen here? And have it build on it itself.
I love both of those answers. I think even if you're telling a story that's not about humans or in any way about humans, they're connected to the human experience. So even if we're talking about aliens or some other species, we feel a humanness to that world and humanness to those characters, like you were saying with the Shire, and that sense of home. That's going to make us interested in a world and connecting and feeling the emotions we want someone to feel. And I definitely agree with you. The other point is the mechanics working for a world. Even if we're not, when you think about like high fantasy or detailed sci-fi, where it's like we're getting all these really nuances of the mechanics, we're getting the elven. Not every story has to have that, but the writer should know, or the world builder should know how those mechanics work, even if it's seen in a little bit. When I'm teaching workshops, what I tell people is that telling a story should make the consumer fall into a dream, whether it's a reader or someone playing a game. Like, you fall into a dream state where you're just following the story, and bad questions wake us up from that dream of like, wait, that doesn't make sense that the world would have this one rule or mechanic, and then it breaks in this scene. We want that disbelief suspended, so they're just following along.
And I'm working on a science fiction novel with another writer, and I'm not a pro at science fiction by any means, and it's been really helpful to have that back and forth, because a lot of things he'll point out, that's not working, and you can't, or I don't know, you can try to be out there and crazy with what you're doing, but it's also got to make sense. Yes. Otherwise, people know. And he's been really good about, okay, you got to draw that back, and this is the direction you need to go. So it's good to get that feedback, I think, from somebody who's really into it.
Yeah, or even just somebody outside of it, right? Because in our heads, we might just go, oh, this is cool or interesting, let me try this. But somebody that is outside of that world can go in and say, is this making sense? So for my first book, Post-High School Reality Quest, it's basically a text adventure game. It's like this girl who's stuck in a text adventure game. So we made this playable demo of the first chapter. And playtesting something is a whole different challenge with creating a story, because when I'm writing a book, there's kind of a linear thing. It's like, if you like it, you'll keep turning the pages, right? But when there's a game, people have to make choices. And so getting the feedback from people playing the game of what I thought were intuitive, obvious choices somebody should make, and they do something totally, totally different. We're like, okay, how do we lead them to make those choices? So yeah, whatever you're doing, get beta readers, get play testers, get someone to kind of help you figure out if the world you're creating is making sense.
I love that. Yeah, I love your first book.
Oh, thank you.
And I think it does create, in a sense, it created its own. You created an own world for her as she was walking through that game and the experiences that she was having. And I think that that's true. Like a lot of the world building happens through the experience of our characters, not necessarily. We can think of it as being in terms of describing and building the world, but it also happens in the action of the story.
Yes. I love that. So thinking about what things would make sense for your character to do, not even just in the world that they're in, but in the world and logic of their mind as well. We're going to learn a lot through action. It's a great point. So what is a favorite example of world building that you have?
Oh, well, I just got into The Wheel of Time. And that's an incredible world that he's built. I can't even, it's amazing. So, but I think, basically, Lord of the Rings immediately came to mind when I was thinking about the question. Harry Potter, I think she created this world that is so real. And that people have just embraced and taken it in all different ways. So I think those are some really strong examples. And then I was thinking there's another book that I read. It's sort of an RPG lit book, but called Hand of Adonai by Aaron Gansky, and he created this world where these kids create a game and then they go into it. Somehow it pulls them into it. But the world was so, like, all these different places. It's one of those things where you get away from it and then suddenly you're like, I'm thinking about it. and I was actually like, you think it comes to you and you're like, oh, where did I read that? Because it just sticks with you, and I think that's a sign of the world. You're still thinking about it when you're done reading.
Yes. And once we're I have messy feelings about Harry Potter, but I think the fact that there's this legacy of people making fan fictions in our world and stuff like that. I think anything where you've got people making fan fictions, that says something. There's such a rich world that we can put ourselves into that, which I think is super cool. A couple of things for world building that I was thinking of. I was recently reading some of the Avatar: The Last Airbender comics, and I think just Avatar in general is such a rich world. And I think what makes it work so well for me, especially in the comics, I think, is that it's this other world, but it talks sneakily about our world. It talks about real issues. And when I'm putting the comics down, I'm like, wow, I'm thinking about the real world parallelism and how are we dealing with this issue in the real world and how should we deal with this issue? And I think that's a great infrastructure to work from too when you're thinking about building a world of what's something you want to talk about reality, but give it some distance. That's actually, my book that's coming up was like that too, about the ghost girl, where there was this family interaction. It was really messy and painful for me. And talking about it in the literal was too painful. So I told it slant, right? I was like, how about I add some fantastical elements? What if there's this ghost? What if there's these rules of this ghost world? And so I think that's something that Avatar does really well. And then I've been watching a playthrough of West of Loathing, and I've been thinking about world building in that because, so for those not familiar, it's kind of a Western, because that's the best way to talk about it. But it does bizarre things. It goes into these
spittoons.
The spittoons. It goes into the world of spittoons. It goes into kind of this alien tech. It goes into commentary on things like current joggers and yoga. But somehow I think the way it uses humor can tie all these seemingly dissimilar things. So it's like a voice almost is the world building there, where it's like, I can believe you throwing all these things that seem out of the world of a Western just because the voice is uniting it. So I think there's multiple factors to world building we can play with. Oh, I put on my notes. I forgot. I have notes. Why did I not look at them? I think environmental storytelling is one of my favorite tools for video games, specifically for world building. So games like Until Dawn, What Remains of Edith Finch, and Life is Strange. Those are ones where the way the world building is sneaky and how it doesn't impede our movement forward in the game. That's something I'm always thinking about now as a writer, like how can I give these little, like what is it my reader or player needs to know immediately, and how can I do that sneakily, kind of like killing two birds with one stone? How can my environment, little details, little objects there do this work of telling us what this world is like? And you'll notice that a lot of some of those examples, they're relatively contemporary. I mean, you know, Life is Strange, you're basically in the real world, but there's time travel, I guess, or like some sort of bizarre element depending on which Life is Strange game. Until Dawn, basically our world, but Wendigos. Edith Finch, really rooted in our world. So world building doesn't just apply to the fantastical, it also applies to our contemporary world.
And I think you can bring out a lot of, you're talking about that underlying meaning, and I think you can bring that out in so many different ways, like just as basic as like a color, you know, like you shade you share like red tones, or I think there's, and then just small little hints that you give, and you don't have to draw attention to it even. I think it's better when the reader discovers it or notices it themselves instead of, you know, us pointing it out.
Okay, here's the thing, pay attention. Yeah, good point. As a writer, what are some of the main things you're thinking about when you're creating a world?
The first thing I think about is just picturing it in my head, and then I try to how to get that picture out in a way that's not me telling the reader, but showing them, and that can be really tricky, especially in the beginning of your story, because there's so much that you need to do in that first section of your story to help the reader get used to your world. And I think there's a balance to it. You kind of have to go with your gut in some things, because I know there've been times where I've thought I'll put this in there. I'll be editing it, and I'll look and I'll think, you know, there's just a nudge to me that no, I'll ignore it. Never ignore it. I always get back and I always notice it. But I think it's important to I picture it and not overshare. And then I think it's important also to go to the why. Why are these things there? You know, and that's something that you need to know. Not necessarily your reader, but you know, you really need to understand the world thoroughly, and ask yourself a lot of questions. And another thing I like, I don't know, like I don't like a lot of description in stories personally. So, but I do like a lot of layering in stories. So when there is, like you sort of set the tone for a scene in a story by the colors that you have, the tone, the words, the harshness, you know, even shorter words, shorter sentences, even your sentence structure kind of sets the tone in the picture. And I think that's part of your world building too. So I don't even we're not talking about dialogue, but even just how the people talk and their tone and all of that works together. So those are the three main things that I think of.
It's funny you were mentioning dialogue, because I was thinking about your book For the Good of All, and I feel like one of the things you did so well was you have this dystopian world, so there's this instinct of like, let me explain everything to everyone. But you didn't. You really just kind of threw us in with the characters, and they just kind of talk as if we aren't listening, because sometimes that's a problem with dialogue too, right? Is you go, let me explain this thing conveniently with you as the player or the reader here, so you could hear this explanation and exposition how this works. Your characters just kind of like talk as they would in the world, and we're just kind of listening in. And I feel like that's the best world building, because there were times where I'm like, what does that mean? But if I'm reading and following, I kind of learn from context. So I think that's something that you can think about when you're telling a story. Is you don't have to explain everything, you don't have to point to everything, but you can, by how you interpose an object or a term, the context in which you put that in, or, you know, if this is mechanics and, you know, like if you're doing a role-playing game or just a literal game, the way that somebody can interact with that term, you can do the world building that way and make it more active for your participant so that they're not having everything shoved down their throat. So that's definitely something I think about too. And I'm always thinking, what does my reader or my player need to know in this immediate moment? Because especially when you're making a new world, like you said, we have to know everything. And so there's this instinct of, let me just info dump all the things at the very beginning, tell you everything, so you know, and we can move forward. But really, a smart story gives you those little seeds. It doesn't kind of interrupt that progression. We're just kind of getting exactly what we need. And the great thing also about not telling everything at the beginning is it can create tension, which is so critical for a story, whether that's through a written medium or through gameplay. Tension's going to be what keeps us turning the pages. It's going to keep making us play forward. So if we don't know everything right away, we have these little snippets. We're going to ask good questions and go, ooh, what does that mean? Ooh, what's the implication of that? Let me keep moving forward. So sometimes when I draft, I overwrite and over-explain things. My setups are always really slow. The first half, I'm kind of figuring out what my world is. I'm figuring out the answers to all those questions, like you were saying. And so I have to cut that a lot and rearrange so that we're really at the beginning getting only exactly what we need in that moment. And we'll get a little bit more as we move forward.
Yeah. But you have to also be careful that you're not, whatever you spend time on needs to matter in the story. So I had one of my critique groups, I was explaining the fruit, this weird fruit that they have, which I thought was interesting. But my critique group was like, well, is that important later on? And I was like, no, but we're spending a lot of time describing it, so it better come back up again.
Chekhov's fruit.
Yeah. So in this story I'm working on right now, my sequel, I have this thing about water balloons, which is just like, it's just like this little thing happens with them throwing water balloons, but it's actually very important to come back up again at the very end of the story. So I don't know, I like it when you can plant seeds like that, but you really have to make them count.
Yes, that's a fantastic point, and that's just the great thing that I point out when I'm reading people's stories and think about for my own. Where we focus is going to, the longer you spend on something, the more you repeat something, that draws a lot of attention to it. So you want to think about using that purposefully, because like you said, that can be seeds. And so when we were making that demo for the first chapter of my first book, we were thinking about what objects would we want someone to play with. Because, again, it was a text adventure, so that is particularly challenging where people can input whatever they want. It's not like multiple choice. So we're thinking, how can you guide them? What objects could we emphasize? Maybe take a little extra time describing or mentioning again, there is that key on the wall. There's still that key. Maybe that worked with a facetious text parser, but yeah, those are things that somebody's going to pay attention to. So notice where you're repeating. Is this really going to be purposeful and helpful or not? So actually, we may have already kind of answered this question, but I'll invite it if there's more we want to add. How do you balance giving information and moving the story forward?
I was going to put exposition versus action. I think it's so beautiful in a story where you can learn about that world through what's going on with the characters instead of the description. Again, I really do not like a lot of description. I just want to get right to it. But I also want, and I want to know, I want the action. I want to see them in that world, living it out, and that world dictating sort of what happens to them in a sense, So I think that part's really important. And there's a balance. I think you really do need to have some description in there. You really do need to. And some of your readers really want that. So, but it's kind of hard to fill it out sometimes.
Yes. Well, an action's going to stick more with the reader or the player. It's more interesting, and especially for the beginning, I always encourage people when I'm doing first pages or first lines, can you get us into that movement? Can you get us into the action? In my answer to this question, I kind of already said, what do we need to know now? I like to think about how can the environment and action teach us about this world. I think something I often have my students do is watch a playthrough of the first 10 minutes of One Home. And I say, write down every object we encounter and write down what narrative information each object provides. And what's phenomenal, first off, I do this all the time, and every single time people discover new insights with the same objects. But what's incredible to me is there's very little exposition. There's occasionally these cassette players of the tapes of this character describing some things that are happening in their world. But mostly you learn a lot about the characters just by walking through the house. Nobody has to say hey, here's the story of this family that just moved to this house. And you don't need exposition. We need a lot less exposition, a lot less description than we think we need. I think that's what it taught me, that readers and players are smart. We as humans are smart. We can put pieces together, so it's just giving those pieces. Another thing I think about is point of view, because whoever's telling the story, what are they going to know that nobody else would know? What unique angle or insight would they have? And sometimes if my beginning's slow or my story's slow, changing point of view does that. But thinking about what they might notice, what that unique point of view would notice, is an interesting question.
I think that's super important, yeah, because in my book, there's a group of people who live in one world, and they see it, you know, that's all they know, and then there are people who are on the outside of that and can see the life that the other people are living in. And so when I switch back and forth, it's very tricky, you know. All right, oh, we didn't know that, or you know, or even I think it's even in the feelings that come across in those characters. It's not really world building, but the, you know, how where they are in that, and their comfort level, and how they come across is kind of dependent on what they know. Yes, about the world.
Well, I think feelings can be part of world building, like you said. You know, all those characters are going to see the world differently, so we're going to get different pieces of the world based on those different perspectives and how they feel about it. And then that helps us think about how should we feel about this world.
And that's a good way with your characters too. If you think there's something that you want to share, you know, again, it goes back to it all making sense. It's all got to make sense. It's got to come together. And there might be a character that is better served to share whatever part of your world you want to share.
And that can take playing. I encourage you to explore and see what point of views are there. I give this exercise of challenging people to write the same scene from 3 different perspectives. And somebody had this story that, it was like a tooth fairy story, and they realized that the tooth would have knowledge that nobody else would, because this person thought they were human and they lost a tooth, but the tooth knew that they weren't actually a werewolf. And so it was like, they played with writing the point of view of the tooth. And it's like, not something you necessarily think of, but like that might create a surprising discovery of like, oh, well, why not? So we may have touched on this also, but what do you think is the biggest pitfall in world building that writers should keep in mind?
I think oversharing. Pretty much covered that. Emphasizing the unimportant. I think that too. I want to say that again because I think whatever you spend time on as a reader, is going to expect something from that. I think a lot of writing is setting up expectations for your reader and promises actually that you're making to them, and you want to deliver. You don't want to leave them hanging. And so many times, you know, I don't know how many times I've like, whatever happened to this part of the story, you know? So yeah, you don't want to do that. And I guess another thing I think is not thought through. I really like stories that have, you know, some sort of meaning behind them, you know, that you can come away with and think through and apply even maybe. But to just read a story that's this, and, you know, it's okay, but it doesn't. Yeah, it's not really right. Whatever.
Yeah, that's a big pet peeve in storytelling at large for me is earning the ending and like following through with the expectations you set at the beginning. So that applies to world building, but that applies to the structure at large as well. I think thinking about what you want to be doing with this story, because I think all of us have things we want to say. And some stories are going to be more didactic than others, but probably there's something we have an opinion about, and there's something we're trying to convey in a story. And so taking a little bit of time to think, what is the one thing I want my player to get away from this story? Or what's the one thing I want my reader to take away from this? And using that as a guide, because that's going to inform world building too. I think some of the most compelling aspects of making us think in a story are how a world functions, how it works, and what that says to our larger world. And so I think we talked a lot about, you know, action and telling. So I try to encourage show more, tell less. Like you said, it's not that we don't tell anything, but maybe we need to tell less probably than we are. And also not enough grounding. Sometimes we're just kind of in this nebulous space where it's all in the author's head and they haven't kind of put it on the page yet. So think about how action and sensory details can work together to kind of put us somewhere. What sensory details would this point of view notice? Because again, different points of view would notice different things. So that not only contributes to world building, but character development too. Of like, well, why would they notice this thing? Why is that significant?
And I give like basic, general rules, but generally you would give, and in any scene you touch on all five senses. So I think that's important to include in just general writing.
Well, that's a really fun thing to think about world building, because I think we tend to think about what we hear and what we see. But what do things smell like? What do they taste like? What do they feel like in the palm of your hand? I think that's going to really place us in the world very viscerally. And it's a good exercise for you to be thinking about your world, because you might come to discoveries where you force yourself to think about all five senses. And you go, oh, well, I didn't really notice that this food smells like gym socks, What an interesting discovery. So, yeah. And so before we go into questions, I'd love to ask, what advice do you have for writers about creating?
I think number one is ask yourself a billion questions. I think you're smart, you're writing, ask those questions. Don't skirt around it, let's get this way, and keep asking them as you go through the story, because, and again, listening to your gut, I think that I'm saying 90% of the time when somebody's pointing something out to me to change, an editor or another critique partner, I always go, I thought of it, but I just let it go. So, just listen to your gut, trust your instincts. And, be leery of your first idea. I think sometimes it's not the first idea, it's the third idea. Maybe the third idea is actually the first idea, but with this little tweak on it, But I think a lot of times, this is great, we just take it and run with it and give it another thought, when there might be something better. So just be leery of your first idea.
I love that. Yeah, that willingness to try new things and to kind of push it. Because right now I'm working on a draft, and what's really interesting in that drafting process is the beginning is a lot of instinct, right? You go, well, this thing seems interesting. I'm going to write it down. Let's see what happens. And I'll kind of run into walls where I'm like, okay, that didn't really sustain me. But as I'm coming back, a lot of those pieces from those original drafts, I keep coming back to them. So pay attention to what you keep coming back to. What's interesting and exciting to you. Because if you're not interested and excited, we're not going to be interested and excited. So following what's interesting to you and kind of digging deeper into that. Why is this interesting? You will find really interesting discoveries. Another piece of advice I really encourage is see it how you can kill two birds with one stone. So look for places where you can show us the world through the action, through the environment, through the dialogue, sensory details. Those kind of tools in your toolbox can kill a lot of birds with one stone, so that you're not feeling like you have to take a bunch of time. Like, let's step aside from the action so I can give you this pertinent info. You can often do multiple things at once. So thinking really purposefully. How can I use this detail? How can I use this scene? How can I use this place, this environment? Is this, is a fight happening in the quiet of a home more tense than in the middle of a Wawa or in the middle of a bar? Depending on the situation, that could be different. If it's somebody that feels very unsafe, if they're in a quiet of a home where nobody can see, that's going to ramp the tension. But if you're in a public place and it's just maybe embarrassing, and there's not necessarily that safety threat, then maybe something in the middle of MAGFest having a huge fight, that's going to create more tension. So you could think about ways that these different tools in your toolbox can do a lot of work for you. Awesome. Before we open to questions, was there any last things you wanted to say?
I'm ready for your questions.
Questions? Anyone got questions? Yes.
So you mentioned sometimes it's not your first idea or second idea or like a revisit of your first idea. How do you keep track of ideas you have that you've scratched so you can go back to things and just track versions of where you went with writing?
Oh, great question. So how do you track different versions of your ideas so you can keep them in mind and go back to them? So I use a tool called Scrivener. I see some nodding. Some familiarity with that tool. It's a word processing tool, and so but how it works differently is that you've got the pane that you're working on, but then you also have this pane called the binder where you can see all these individual files. I write in really random ideas. I'm like, maybe here's a scene for the setup. Maybe here's the climax. And so I'm just kind of like going all over the place, and that way I can see them. You can also stack things, so I can have underneath something, I can say like, this is Act 1, or Act 1 ideas. Here's some scenes that maybe could open at the beginning, and I can substack them. But it also has version control even within each document, that you can snapshots, so you can look at multiple, like you can look at the version history for each individual document. So if you're somebody that's like me and likes to write in lots of little random spurts, and maybe not beginning to end consecutively, you might find a tool like Scrivener is very helpful.
Yeah, I've used Scrivener as well, but I also, and it's also be as simple as just the way you name your files. You know, you could, and in a lot of my files, I will write Ren, 6, start, Starry Night, whatever is going to help me remember, and then I keep your file, then you can create your folders in Word, and you can do it that way as well.
Yeah, I have a lot of folders as well for old ideas, because something might come back, and
I save everything.
Yes, I think it's a good idea to save everything. Yes.
So I actually had a question about the previous point around the way that you structure your world and making sure that that's coherent and concise and works. But the question I have is about breaking that structure as a way to build tension and draw the reader directly into the story in a way that is uniquely emotionally gripping. So my name is Mike Schley. I design and build maps and landscapes for D&D, particularly Forgotten Realms, very often. And one of the things that compels me as an artist is being able to build worlds that are then built on by others. That's also the key to role-playing games, in that it's a collaborative storytelling process. So as the DM or as the artist or as the storyteller, you're bringing this world to the table, and the actions that occur in that moment among friends around the table are what bring that forward in a very real way. So there's attention to the realization of that in the lives of the characters, whether they're in a book or whether they're sitting at a table suspending their disbelief for a few hours. Could you talk about how your characters grapple with the things that aren't in their control, like the other person on the other side of the table, or the things in their world that are outside of their realm of knowledge, and how that can serve as sort of a MacGuffin that gets them outside of their own head and moves the story forward in ways that are unexpected and exciting and vibrant.
Okay, so that's a really great question. I'm not sure I'm going to fully capture everything you said, but you were talking particularly from the context of map making and the idea that a player is going to contribute to a story in ways that, like, how do you account for that when you are creating a world, when you're creating your characters? Is that capturing your
Or is it something that you can account for in that, if the thing about tabletop role-playing or tabletop gameplay is that the other person that's on the other side of the table, they may be playing a role, but it's not a role that I dictate, in the sense that the author has to leave something open for the imagination of the other person that's, whether they're reading the book or sitting at the other side of the table, to really, like, if they're going to suspend their disbelief in the structure of the story, they have to actually believe that they're in the story, and the only way that they can do that is to, in a sense, have free will in that story to act on it. And that's, to me, what I think builds the story, especially in tabletop role-play or gameplay.
Yeah, so it's really, if I'm understanding right, this is a question about how do we account for the contribution the player or the reader is going to make into a story, and should we account for it? Like, how do we deal with that? And I think that's a really, did that capture your question?
Yeah.
Or, okay, we can talk more after. So, yeah, I resonate with that in multiple ways. So for that first book, we made that demo, and it was so open-ended, being, based on a text parser and text adventure where people can input anything, and it makes you realize, how much a player is going to be contributing. And I think, like you say, that can be a really exciting, wonderful part of it, of storytelling, but it can also be a challenge. And even releasing a book, you get reviews where people don't get what the book is. And you can't, once you release something out into the world, whoever is consuming that, they're contributing to that story. And so, yeah, I think that is a reality. And I think depending on what you're trying to achieve, how you take that into account will vary, right? So if there's a certain outcome I am trying to make happen for a player, I'm going to have to really think about how I can guide that player to the things that matter to me. But it's kind of like pick your battles, right? Because you can't, if you're literally giving them a Disney dark ride, like then they're not being a player. Nobody really wants that. So, but like you say, there's that inherent free will that they're going to be imposing into a story. So you have to kind of decide, well, what do I really care about? What do I really want to make sure they get from this? What do I really want to make sure that they do? And how can I give them those road signs, those sneaky road signs that suggest and invite, that they would want to investigate that instead of, being navvy, like, hey, you better go over here. Like, I don't know. I don't really want that in the game. I want things that inherently interest me, and I inherently go to them. So, like, go on home, they talk about how they designed this house with the stairwell right in the front, which instantly invites you. You kind of go, ooh, this is interesting, the light, the way the light's hitting that, you go, ooh, I kind of want to go up there, but also I see that there's options on the side, so I probably should do those first, and then I'm going to go up this really cool thing. So how we design a landscape to make it inherently appealing, I think can help guide our player to do the things we want them to do. But I think similarly as a reader, I'm trying to think, what's interesting to me, what do I care about, what do I want them to take away from this, and I can't force them to get that, but I am going to try to ask questions and try to, through showing more, telling less, creating scenes and actions interesting, I'm going to do everything possible to invite them to think about certain things. And playtesting and having beta readers can help with this too, because I can see, is the intended effect achieved? So if I ask, what's the one big thing you take from my book? Or what's the one big thing you feel? I think we talked about the other day. If they're answering the way I want them to answer, I go, okay, this thing has succeeded. I can bring it out into the world. But if it's not coming through yet, then I say, okay, well, maybe I need to bring that back and reconsider if I'm effectively laying those little kind of gingerbread pieces.
And I don't think you should be scared or fearful or worried about them taking your story to a different place necessarily. I think that part of the goal is that our story would have, story would have like your story, you see where it goes, but also that it has another meaning, and that meaning is born in each person as they're reading it, bringing their own experiences to it, their own life. So they're going to see different things, and I think that now the rule of thumb is you don't feed them, like you wouldn't necessarily describe your main character, even their color, their hair color, their eye color. It used to be standard, like we would know exactly how they looked, but now you don't do that. So the reader can kind of picture however they are. So I think that there's a lot more freedom now, and I think but guiding them to a certain place in your story where you want them to go, that's where all of the elements have to work together. And you're right, I think you can only know that when you get some feedback from other people.
Well, I think what you were bringing up with description, that makes me think of point of view as well, because the reason I don't tend to do that is because nobody would ever be like, I look in the mirror, that's my blonde hair, and my ice blue eyes. Like, we don't do that, right? So like, why would my character do that? So thinking about how you can use what a point of view would notice and what they would do. But you're right, it does create a lot of freedom too, because I can read a book and I can see the characters one way, and somebody else can a different way. That's okay.
Yeah, I think that to me is like an ultimate goal for them to read the book and to walk away with their own. I've had people read my stuff and they're like, sure. I didn't really think of that when I wrote it, but yeah, if that works for you, that's great. I like that. I like that they're drawing from their own experiences and making something new. That's a victory.
Yes, and they could discover things that maybe I didn't intend in my story, but that were meaningful to them. Yeah, that's cool. So, great question. I feel like that's what we can talk about all day. Yes, with the flowers.
So actually, kind of following on that wonderful point that you just made, that had me thinking. You mentioned the notion of what a reader is bringing to a story, and that's a little bit different than what you expect when you talk about like a tabletop game or something where players are directly interacting with the lore, the world building, the background you've built. But I think that's actually somewhat true too, in that any kind of story, there are going to be gaps in the world building you make. You know, you're obviously not showing everything, as you brought up. There's focusing on what's important, and the reader is going to fill in for themselves what they think goes in those holes. And I think maybe my question to you would be, do you have any insights on how you teach your reader or viewer or whoever you were telling the story to, teaching them to fill the gaps in your world building on their own, accurately, through the tone, the details they do know, through the perspectives and attitudes of the society you're portraying, you know, teaching your viewer, reader, whatever, to fill in the gaps and add their own lore to understanding your world where you cannot.
That's a great question. So this is kind of following up on what we were talking about. How do you kind of teach your reader or player to fill in those gaps, to get things about the world that you want them to? Is that accurately?
Yeah, where necessarily maybe you can't go into all of the little details, all of the nitty gritty, but you've taught your reader enough about how your world operates to accurately fill those details in their mind that might not be important.
Right, because we can't, exactly, we can't say everything, so how do we teach the player?
Yeah, for my first novel, I had, we ended up putting a glossary in the back, which I felt like it was a failure, because I really wanted them not to need the glossary to figure out what all these different things meant. But there were just, I had different words for time. So I had, for a day, it was called a roll, for a year, it was a turn, and cycles. But people found that so confusing, and I was like, why is it confusing? Because they're actually, the way. So I don't know that you can always. I don't know. I mean, to me, it was pretty clear, and to some people, I think it just depends on your. And probably what it comes down to is your target audience, and it might be that when you click with the right people, then it works. And I don't know. I think that ultimately, you want, I want a bestseller. I want the world to love it. But the truth of the matter is, that's our stories, for the most part, aren't meant for the world. They're meant for certain people. They're meant for that group. And when you find those people, it will click. But probably feedback is the best thing you can do to know if it's working or not.
So I feel so silly. I have not seen. I've been reading your book, and I looked, and I don't even remember there being a glossary. And I'm like, why was
no, not this one. It was my other.
Oh, so okay. Because that one does use terms, and so what I was going to say is it works because you use them organically in context. So through the context, we can kind of go, okay, that's what this thing is. So I guess that would be my suggestion for the filling in the holes is through action and context, what sort of things can you gesture to give us those mechanics of how the world works? Because if you give us those mechanics in action, then in our head, we're going to go, okay, this is how it works. And so when we're thrown in other contexts, we can kind of guess based on those rules that we know, that's going to help us fill in those gaps. We're going to kind of have some parameters that were built, but I think when you do it through the tools we've talked about, action and sensory details and scene, maybe your characters walk into a bar and there's something happening in the bar, they're overhearing a conversation, and you can use those moments of action and detail to teach us things about the world that then when they encounter other things, the things that they learned in that context will teach that they can apply that in a different way. That would be kind of my suggestion.
Yeah, there's this scene in the book where the guy is trying to show off for a run and impress her, so he's like telling her everything that he knows, but I use that as a way to kind of get a lot of information out, because it's like, you just like seeing the lights, these weird lights come on, and so he points that out, and she's, so I just think that there's different ways that you can do it, but like that whole point, I think in that scene, you're all caught up in him trying to impress her, so it's not really, you're not really thinking, oh, she's giving me exposition and explaining what's going on down there.
Mm-hmm. So it's like an organic context for something to be happening.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question about point of view, because I've been struggling over some feedback I got recently, that, let's see, how to phrase it, like, point of view kind of plops you into the the eyes of a character or the mind of a character, which makes them feel like a main character or a very important character. And so the more characters you see behind the eyes up, you start feeling like these characters are also important. So that's like, yeah, I think that's a new mistake I made. I thought I could be George R.R. Martin, but I need to walk before I can run. I'm not committed to 2,000 pages. It's more like 200. So, but yeah, I like writing from different perspectives, and so the question is, like, how do you make them still feel like a side character if you're going to do that anyway, versus making them feel like a main character, and like, what are the how do you tell what levels to write at and what levels the reader's going to perceive at? Is it?
Great question. So the question is about point of view. How do you use multiple point of views for secondary characters, especially because using a point of view makes a character feel significant and important, but you may want these smaller characters to do that, so like how do you do that? You want to say something?
I think that it's important, like, everybody's, this is going to sound selfish, they're not really, but everything's focused on that main character. So whenever you're in another point of view, that point of view still got to move your main character's story forward. And like I have one scene where Owen, who's the love interest for Ren, he's getting moved up, and he's actually getting on the council, and he's all excited about it, and it's all about this thing in his life. But in that scene, his focus is also on whether or not she's going to notice him and how that's going to. So there's still this other. You always have to bring in the main character, even if it's even if you never mention them. I think that there needs to be this underlying current that the protagonist, something's going on in the protagonist's life.
That's a fantastic point, Jenny. Yeah, and I think function and purpose, like with all these other tools, right? Like, why do we have to have this point of view? How is it going to not just propel a main character forward, which I think you're absolutely right, but just the story at large? And so that doesn't, like, you absolutely can and should use multiple point of views and from smaller characters. Just really make sure if you are, in front of a council and they said, like, why do you need this point of view, that you can make a really good argument, like, we have to have this. And so I think that's an important thing. I think also the amount of time and space. Not all point of views have to be created equal. You can have a dominant point of view and then occasionally splintered in others. And I've seen, stories in different mediums that do this, where it's, they have mostly certain the main points of views, but then occasionally other ones, there's oh my goodness, I thought of an example, I could think of the cover, I can't think of the actual name, so that's not really helpful, but it's like a love story told from all these different perspectives, so it's got the main characters and then these other characters in their lives, and it's got stuff like the squirrel in the park where they first met, stuff like that, so you can use really smaller points of views, but think about what knowledge would they have that nobody else would, why do you need this, how is it going to move things forward?
Yeah, I'm reading a book right now, and I thought of this last night, I was like, you know what, he's killed off 2 points of view. I was like, oh, and at the time, it just occurred to me, it's like, oh yeah, well, you can do that. And it was helpful to have their point of view in those scenes, but they weren't, they're gone.
Yeah.
And then you have to avoid Mary Sueism. Having everything so focused around a main character or a main story thread, then it's like, I don't know, I guess it's focusing on the realism or making it feel like the whole world matters and the other characters matter, but this character matters the most because the story is being driven through them.
Well, and also just not making your character your Mary Sue, right? Like making a complex character that has flaws and fails and things like that is going to help too. But that's a good point about the centrality. That's why I guess I like to think about just what's the story trying to achieve at large. Because most stories have like a protagonist. It doesn't necessarily make you feel like it's a Mary Sue and everything revolves around them. It can be sneakier than that while still doing that function.
Yeah, yes. I think that you, the example I gave, he's on the council, which really had nothing to do with her, but eventually it does play out. It does affect her in a great way. So actually, in a very negative way. So that, in that sense, it doesn't mention her. He did talk about her, but I think in that sense, it's the bigger move on the bigger effect on the story itself. So.
And in that exact scene, you may not see directly how they connect, but the cause and effect, it ties together. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, we got time for a couple more questions. Green.
So when you write a book and you do the world building for it, usually you start kind of small and then you get a little bit bigger as the book goes on. But sometimes people make multiple books, they make a whole series, and then you've got to keep track of the world building over 3, 4, 5 books, maybe 2 entire series of books, like if you were writing the Percy Jackson series, for example. How do you guys recommend keeping track of your world building and like the events over the course of time and over the course of the books?
Great question. So how do you keep track of your world building in relation to time and everything that's happened?
Oh yeah, I'm not the best at that.
Totally valid.
I've tried different things, I've tried like mapping things out, I've tried the graph, I've done, so yeah, I think that Scrivener is helpful. I think that having my files is helpful. And I think immersing yourself in the world is helpful. You're there, you really can't come out of it until you're done. Otherwise,
Yeah, I'm really bad at it too, so it's kind of like a do as I say, not as I do sort of thing. I know people that, keep Bibles, right, where they document everything, like here's the document that says everything. And if that's helpful for you, great. I think you should do whatever's most helpful for you. I mean, I'm totally sold on Scrivener, so I always organize things that, like you said, that are related to that, and keep notes that way. Honestly, I do a lot of just rereading what I've already read and kind of putting myself in the headspace.
I think it's important to, when you read through your stuff, to have that in your mind. Because in my manuscript, I will put comments in there like, oh, this is going to need to come back up again. Don't forget that you said this is what you called this, and that's just all in the comments, so that when it's an easy way for me to find it. That's helpful.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And then you do keep a Bible. I didn't think of that, but like and I do that when you send it to the editor. I would send all of this stuff to them. Like this is, these are. I would send them the glossary, which wouldn't go in the book, but and all of this information so that they have it, because they a lot of times, depending on your editor's completely coming at it from the dark necessarily. So but I do think you have to think in those terms when you're looking at it, which is a whole different hat that you put on than when you're creating it.
Admittedly, I like many people here, I'm mostly interested in the tabletop RPG aspect of it, and so keeping track of like the things that your characters do, as well as the things that you do, is like a whole nother layer on top of that. But I've struggled a lot with. I'm very visual as a person when I'm like mapping things out when I'm for a campaign that I'm working on right now, and I find that I run out of space for physical objects to be placed on like a board or in my room or on a whiteboard or something like that. So I'm trying to figure out how I can keep that like need for physicality while also having a lack of space. And so those are very good options. Thank you for recommending.
Have you seen World Anvil?
Say again?
World Anvil?
That's a good
I was also going to suggest mural.
Sure, I'll take a look at that.
Great, we got people that have suggestions. I'm like mad props to y'all to do that. Okay, I see a few hands. We're gonna get to everyone. Spanton, or not Spanton. Sorry, you're the oh my gosh, I can't think of your name from the original Undertale.
Metaton.
Metaton, thank you. I love that song. Why can't I think of the name? Yes.
This isn't exactly a question, but I wanted to say I really appreciated what you guys said about things being earned, and how that doesn't apply to even just endings. I think it applies to just things existing within the world more broadly as well, because something that frustrates me to no end is when people use Tolkien fantasy races in their setting and don't put any reason why. It's like you can't just shorthand why you have elves here, because then everyone's going to think they're annoying and pompous or whatever, or unless you're Elder Scrolls and you lean into that direction. So I just wanted to say that I really appreciated that, and it made me think about some other things too. And I think that just because multiple people have mentioned TTRPGs, I think that is an issue that TTRPGs have, because a writer, Gary Gygax, was not. He just lifted that from Tolkien. So, it can be you can say well, all this stuff is around, people use it often, so I should too, when no, you have to really develop and earn why, Why is it a feudal state? Why are the elves? Why are the dwarves?
Why are the
So I just really appreciated you guys mentioned things being earned, and I just wanted to share that.
Thank you for saying that, and I think that's an important point too, is that all of us may use some shorthand inherently just because explanations are long. But like you said, if you're using shorthand, you got to use the shorthand for good reason. So yeah, think about everything you use. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Did you have anything you want to add? Okay, yeah, the front.
All right, to add on to that a little bit, my question was, when you're writing, how do you keep your writing from being too formulaic, cliche, and therefore uninteresting, especially in the bounds of your specific demographics and genres?
Great question. So how do we keep things not cliche in your writing?
Yeah.
Well, usually when I write, I do the first draft and I try not to worry about that too much. So that kind of cleanup and deeper stuff comes in your third, fourth, fifth draft. I think you have to, and that's that hat that you have to put on where you're looking at it from a different angle and seeing that and being willing to cut it. And I think too, it helps to be well read. I think when we're aware of what's out there and what's being said, then it makes us better writers.
Yeah, and reading outside of our genres, because to some degree there is going to be some formulaicness to stories we tell, because depending on what genre you're doing, there's conventions to that genre. There's certain expectations. When I'm writing middle grade, there's certain boxes that kind of need to be checked. That said, so one, reading diversely will help us think about how we can break conventions in a meaningful, interesting way. I think specificity also is a powerful tool. What is based on our own lived experience, emotionally, and in any other factor, the more we dig into what we know and what is meaningful to us. I'm always trying to dig into what am I struggling with right now? What am I learning right now? And then transposing those into environments that are interesting to me. And what has always shocked me is that it seems so counterintuitive that the more specific you get, the more universal it becomes, the more relatable. Like when I was writing about an autistic protagonist learning her diagnosis and learning how to self-advocate, I was like, I had gotten enough ableist comments in the past of like, oh, your character's not relatable and all this stuff. So I was like, oh gosh, is anyone going to relate to this weird story about a girl likes dragons? And what I found is the more I leaned into what I knew and the more that I was specific in what I knew, the more people were like, I relate to that, I get that. So even, in extraordinary contexts, not just our everyday world, when we talk about what we know and what we feel and what we're thinking and what's interesting and exciting to us, we're going to push past cliches. We're going to get to a universality, but it's going to be like people are going to feel that authenticness of what we know. So sometimes that means just continuing to dig. Sometimes, like you said, the first answer, the quickest thing that comes to us is the most vague, the most cliche. So sometimes making list prompts I find very helpful. So, one that my mentor would always use is, who are you? And having your character answer that question over and over and over again. But really, you can do that in generating lists for anything. And your first couple answers will be more cliche, more vague. But the deeper you go in that list, the more interesting it's going to get. And the more you'll probably go, ooh, I like this. This surprised me. And that's the kind of stuff you should go with, is what's interesting and surprising and exciting to you. Cliches will not be as interesting and exciting to you. So it will inherently make those fall away a little bit.
And I think that also the first thing, like we said, the first thing that you get to usually isn't the right, but I think it isn't where you land, but I think it's important to ask, there's 3 levels of questions. So you have your initial storyline, or cliche, your initial cliche. But then you go back, step back a layer and ask, well, how did we get here? And then once you get that answer, then you step back a layer one more time and say, well, how do they feel then? And I think you definitely, when you're working deep into a story, you always have to get back to the feelings. It always comes back to those.
Yeah, well said. So I feel bad. I wanted to get to everyone's questions, but we're out of time. That said, we will stick around for a few extra minutes. So if you've got, those of you that had questions, 5 fools, stay around for a couple minutes. If you had a question and we didn't get to it, come up and ask us real quick. We'd love to talk to you. We can talk in the hall as well. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. Happy MAGFest.